my country, deed I do, but oh, that war has made me blue. I like fighting, that's my name, but fighting is the least about the fighting game. When Mr. Hoover said to cut my dinner down, I never... Feminine men, which is the rooster, which is the hen? It's hard to tell them apart today, and say, sister is busy learning to shave, brother just out in feminine way. It's hard to tell them apart today, hey, hey. Girls were girls and boys were boys when I was a tot. Now we don't know who is who or even what's what. Knickers and trousers, baggy and wide, nobody knows who's walking inside. Those masculine women and feminine men. I cut my coal, but now they dug deep in my soul. I've got the blues, I've got the blues, I've got the alcoholic blues.
You know, we sometimes think traffic lights have been around ever since the first car. Not so. Before the early 1920s, the roads were a hodgepodge of drivers. There were no rules of the road until a Clevelander came along.
It all began pretty close to here, a Cleveland crossroads. Our world changed that day. We've not been the same since. It was an invention to help us maneuver through life, invention of the traffic light in the early 1920s. It still stops us in our tracks, holds us for a moment, and then flashes the go-ahead. A Clevelander gave the world its first three-position traffic light. He saw the need coming because of an explosion of traffic on the roads in Cleveland and America. Life was changing.
right around the First World War and right after, there were so many new cars on the streets that people began to realize that there needed to be some kind of rules of the road. There were none.
No more beer, my heart to cheer. Goodbye, whiskey, you used to make me pretty. So long, highball.
DeForest talking picture. Sorry. DeForest and Case, test number 3.
This time, the sound is perfectly clear. DeForest and Case have brought sound to the silver screen.
So long, Jim, oh, tell me when you're coming back again.
Then, in the late 1920s, scientists across the globe, including Scottish inventor John Logie Baird, finally developed a technique to send moving pictures through the air. As they said at the time, "We have lit a candle that will never go out." That light still burns today, and it is shining ever brighter.
I've got the blues since they amputated my blues. Lordy, Lordy, war is, well, you know, so I don't have to tell. Oh, I've got the alcoholic blues, some blues.
The structure of world peace cannot be the work of one man or one party or one nation. It must be a peace which rests on the cooperative effort of the whole world. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1945. 27 years earlier, American President Woodrow Wilson began his efforts to create an international coalition for peace, forming an organization that would become his most recognizable success as well as his most devastating failure. It would be called the League of Nations, a revolutionary step in the history of international politics, an innovative shift in diplomatic philosophy, paving the way for world peace. With the absence of major powers like the United States and the resurgence of nationalism in the 1930s, however, the League was doomed to be engulfed in the flames of World War II to have its successor, the United Nations, rise from the ashes. In 1915, the imperial powers of Europe fought in the most devastating war the world had ever known. Because of the recent industrial boom, improved weapons and numbers drastically increased the destructive capacity of the major military powers. It was a war to end all wars.
When war broke out in 1914, Wilson thought that the war was a result of this flawed international system. These competing alliances, the rise of militarism across Europe, an arms race. The existing system didn't have a supervisory authority. It was anarchy. It was the law of the jungle.
The system was so unstable because international standards were ineffective. Beginning in the 17th century, international laws were developed, largely the work of Dutch scholar Hugo Grotius. He created the legal science to regulate warfare and suggested the formation of collective security organizations. This fueled an entirely new age of diplomacy, and international legal institutions began to form. Many of these, however, did nothing to stop war. If anything, they made the objectionable conditions of war more bearable. When Wilson traveled to Europe to push forward his League of Nations, he was greeted with enormous enthusiasm. Thousands poured into the streets to applaud him, and many even hailed him as a savior. At the Paris Peace Conference, Wilson was appointed the chairman of the commission designated to draft the League's covenant. France and Britain objected to many of his efforts, saying that since they had suffered the brunt of the casualties, Germany should pay them exorbitant reparations. Wilson found himself pitted against two diplomatic sharks, George Clemenceau of France and David Lloyd George of Britain, whose national interests forced Wilson to compromise on his 14 points to the point where Germany felt entirely betrayed, having been promised the points as the foundation for the treaty. Wilson returned home in 1919 to a very tense legislative debate. Wilson's decision not to bring any Republican senators to Paris put him at odds with the very people he had to convince to ratify the treaty.
At one point, the Democratic leadership in the Senate said to the president, "We can get the League through. We can get the treaty through if we will only compromise with your big foe." Henry Cabot Lodge, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And Wilson was angry and his voice shook and he said, "Let Lodge compromise." He was not going to bend.
When Lodge compiled a list of reservations objecting to elements of the League's covenant that might infringe on American sovereignty, Wilson left on a 10,000-mile speaking tour urging the necessity of the League. The senators remained steadfast in their opposition, saying that the League would destroy the Monroe Doctrine and take away control of immigration. On March 19, 1920, the Senate made its decision to reject the Treaty of Versailles, and Wilson's efforts to create a lasting peace along with it. The Senate rejection of the treaty handicapped the League of Nations, but it was still able to operate without its primary sponsor. The first international court was formed. Over 2,000 treaties were signed. Numerous conflicts were settled using arbitration. In 1920, an international health office was formed to fight typhus in Poland, not to mention the other bodies formed to advance communications and world markets. The policy of disarmament was introduced, where members were obligated to reduce their national stores of weapons. The boldest of the League's peace efforts occurred in 1928, when 31 nations renounced war entirely by signing the multilateral treaty known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact.
Prohibition, that's the name. Yeah, prohibition drives me insane. I'm so thirsty, soon I'll die. I'm simply gonna evaporate, I'm just that dry. I wouldn't mind to live forever in a train if my daily thirst they'd only let me quench. But not with Steve-O or ginger ale. I want real stuff by the pail.
Remembered as the Jazz Age, the restless decade, the roaring 20s, the era of wonderful nonsense. But was it something more? A time of growing conflict between those who could accept change and those who would not. Between those whose minds were open to modern ideas and those who clung to fundamental beliefs. Between those who could accept the complexity of the 20th century and tried to cope with it, and those who rejected the new and tried to return to an America that was past. And in the struggle, America frequently became a battleground. November the 11th, 1918, a day of jubilation. The Great War is over. 2 million American soldiers begin the journey home. What sort of America did they leave? What sort of America will they find? What sort of America do they want? They left an America led by President Woodrow Wilson, spurred on by noble words to a great crusade to make the world safe for democracy. They had been plunged into the most bitter and bloody war in the history of man. A war that cost hundreds of billions of dollars and left over 8 million dead. Now they return to an America changed forever by the experiences of war. The country rejects world leadership and refusing membership in the League of Nations. It attempts instead to go its own way. The nation is granting women the right to vote. America goes dry and embraces a new Puritanism under Prohibition and the Volstead Act. It is an America in which some have gotten very rich from the war. but most have not. Working men are caught in the wartime inflation and the rising cost of living. A rash of strikes occur after the war. Strikes of steel workers, seeking a reduction in the 12-hour day they work in the mills. A general strike throughout the entire city of Seattle. In the city of Boston, police find they can no longer support their families on a $21 a week salary. They strike for higher wages and petition to join a union. With the police on strike, the city is defenseless. Hoodlums have a field day. Widespread looting takes place. Governor Calvin Coolidge of Massachusetts says,
"There's no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anytime, anywhere."
Coolidge brings in the National Guard. The strikers are fired. Almost a complete new police force is hired. In 3 days, the strike is broken. But these strikes and this agitation at home is connected in the public mind with the revolution taking place in Russia and threatening other countries of Europe. Is America itself in danger of a communist revolution?
I've got the blues, I've got the blues, I've got the alcoholic blues. No more beer, my heart to cheer. Goodbye, whiskey, you used to make me frisky. So long, highball, so long, gin. Oh, tell me when you're coming back again. Blues, I've got the blues.
Hello sports fans, my name is Professor S, and today we are talking history and we're talking economics. We're also going to take a page out of the Art Vandal playbook, imports and exports. We're talking the Hawley-Smoot tariff, and we're doing it on Hasty History. But before we get to Hawley and Smoot, let's talk tariffs. What are they? A tariff is basically a tax on imports and exports. So when I say that the Hawley-Smoot tariff raised tariffs on imports in the United States, you know that means that it raised taxes on the stuff being brought into the United States by other countries to be sold. So that means that other countries are having to pay more money to sell their stuff in the US. That makes those other countries mad. But before we get too much into the specifics, let's talk context. In 1929, the Great Depression hits, and it makes everybody nervous. So what America wants to do is protect its workers from foreign competition. For example, the United States would much rather have a U.S. worker make something in a factory rather than the U.S. buying that same thing from another country, even if it's cheaper. Giving American money to other countries is not going to help stimulate the American economy. In economic terms, this is called protectionism. Willis Hawley and Reed Smoot were two politicians who figured that if the United States raised tariffs on imported goods, then that would give the American farmers and merchants a better shot at having competitive prices on their own American goods. These two guys introduced the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which was officially known as the Tariff Act of 1930. Now, the act passes both the House and the Senate because all of these politicians are trying to do right by the people that they represent and protect their workers. But the economists and the businessmen of the time, even people like Henry Ford, were pleading like crazy with President Herbert Hoover to veto the bill. Even President Hoover had concerns that raising tariffs and making it more expensive to import goods was going to make these other countries mad. And that was the last thing he wanted in the wake of World War I. Even so, eventually Hoover relents and he signs the bill. With the act passed and the tariffs raised, surprise, surprise, all the other countries get mad. All of a sudden, they're being told that if they want to sell their goods in the United States, they're going to have to pay an arm and a leg. Not only does this make the other countries mad to the point that they don't want to sell their goods in the United States anymore, it also makes them raise their own tariffs out of spite, so that if American importers and exporters want to sell their goods in other countries, now they have to pay an arm and a leg. At the end of the day, the Hawley-Smoot tariff did a lot more harm than good. See, it helped the U.S. a little bit in the short term, but in a globalized economy, something that helped the U.S. in the short term and hurt the rest of the world in the long term meant that the rest of the world in the short term wanted to see the U.S. hurt in the long term.
Since they amputated my boot, Lordy, Lordy, war is, well, you know, so I don't.
February 1917, World War I rages. The Tsar is away at the Eastern Front, having taken personal command of the army. Meanwhile, demonstrations and protests against food shortages, bread prices, mismanagement of the war, poor working conditions, and more boil over in the capital, Petrograd, aka St. Petersburg. The fighting and protesting continue for a few days before parts of the military join in with the crowd and arrest the Tsar's ministers. The provisional government, made up of moderate Duma ministers, takes over. Tsar Nicholas II abdicates, but rather than pass the throne on to his only son Alexei, who is ill with hemophilia, he gives it to his younger brother Mikhail. Mikhail in turn meets with the provisional government and says, "Thanks, but no thanks." He abdicates the next day. All across the land, the people rejoice at the end of the Tsarist autocracy. But Russia's involvement in the unpopular war and food shortages continue. Bread prices rise, and the people's call for land reform is left unaddressed. A constituent assembly made up of representatives from around the nation is planned to decide the permanent government. April. The Germans, Russia's wartime enemy, help Lenin to return from exile in an attempt to further weaken the chaotic country. Lenin, having missed out on the February Revolution, denounces all sides but his, the Bolshevik Party. In his famous April Theses, he calls for the overthrowing of the provisional government, with instead all power to the Soviets. He tries to rile up the masses once again to incite another spontaneous coup. This doesn't work. Lenin pushes on. He demands that Russia leave the war immediately. This position instantly wins him troop support, a military connection he will use later. Throughout the summer, the Bolsheviks continue to poke and prod to set off mass demonstrations and remove the provisional government. In June, the Minister of War, Alexander Kerensky, orders the new offensive in the war. Major fail. Lenin acts fast to try to agitate the masses. The Bolsheviks, along with the soldiers and sailors of Kronstadt, attempt a coup with the July Putsch. They fail. Kerensky responds by arresting the guilty Bolsheviks, except for Lenin, who manages to escape and hide out in Finland. Kerensky is promoted to prime minister, replacing Prince Lvov, whose 4 months as prime minister turned his hair completely white. The country is in turmoil. Discontent and disillusionment abound, with failures on the front, famines at home, chaos in the factories and the street, and increasing class polarization. In August, there is the chaotic Kornilov affair, in which General Kornilov attempts to crush the Petrograd Soviet and overthrow the provisional government. The provisional government turns to the Petrograd Soviet, including the Bolsheviks, for help stopping him. Result: Kornilov fails and support for the Bolsheviks increases, while support of Kerensky and the now obviously weak provisional government decreases. End of summer. The Bolsheviks are gaining popularity and win a majority in the Petrograd Soviet, which is a powerful council of workers and soldiers with whom the provisional government shares power. From his hiding spot in Finland, Lenin sees a golden opportunity for the Bolsheviks' revolution before the Constituent Assembly's November elections. Lenin's followers hide out at the Smolny Institute, a former school for girls. October 24th. Lenin, back in the capital, disguises himself as a drunk with a toothache and heads to the Smolny Institute. Bolshevik troops creep out in the night and begin occupying strategic points in the capital. Bridges, railway stations, the army headquarters. No shots are fired. October 25th. By morning, Kerensky has fled the Winter Palace, the only government building not yet occupied. By this time, the palace is only protected by Junkers, who are local military academy cadets. The Bolsheviks position the cruiser Aurora outside the palace. No one wants to fire on the other. Finally, at 2 a.m. on October 26th, with little or no violence, the revolutionaries break into the palace and arrest the remaining ministers. They are taken to prison cells in the Peter and Paul fortress. Kerensky never returns. A pretty low-key anticlimactic event, more of a coup than a revolution. Afterwards, the Second Congress of Soviets makes a decree for land, which officially socializes all land for redistribution to peasant communes. A new provisional government is established, the Soviet People's Commissars, SPC. Lenin is chairman, and all the members are Bolshevik. They still plan to attend the Constituent Assembly's November election. A decree for peace is declared, and Lenin gets to work ending Russia's involvement in the war. In November, the elections for members of the Constituent Assembly are held. But when the Bolsheviks receive a mere 23% of the votes, they declare one of the opposition parties, the Cadets, illegal and demand the Assembly voluntarily give up its authority. The Assembly refuses, but does not challenge the Bolsheviks. Once the Assembly adjourns, the Bolsheviks declare it dissolved. The Third Congress of Soviets replaces the Assembly. This group removes the word provisional from the description of the SPC, and thereby makes Lenin and the Bolsheviks the permanent rulers of the country. And then there were 3 years of civil war.
Hush, little barroom, don't you cry. You'll be
In the early 1920s, many Americans were terrified that communists would attempt to take over the country. Who were the communists? Why was there such a widespread fear of them? In 1917, Russia was taken over by a communist group known as the Bolsheviks. Communism is an economic system in which there is no private ownership of businesses or property. Because the average American takes great pride in the personal ownership of homes and businesses, communism was viewed as a threat to the American way of life. From the moment this revolution occurred in Russia, there were widespread fears that a similar type of communist uprising would occur in the United States. Some Americans felt that the recent influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe, where communist and anarchist philosophies were prevalent, only increased the likelihood of such an event. In 1919, it appeared that many of these fears would be proven correct. A plot was uncovered in which 36 bombs were mailed out to important political figures, as well as prominent businessmen. U.S. Attorney General Alexander Palmer and Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. were both targeted. John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan were also threatened. On June 2, 1919, 8 more bombs exploded simultaneously in different cities across the country. Following these 2 incidents, the U.S. Justice Department launched a series of raids that came to be known as the Palmer Raids. This was an attempt to arrest and deport communists and anarchists who were seen as potentially dangerous. More than 500 foreign-born citizens were eventually deported. This panic over a communist threat became known as a Red Scare. The term is derived from a popular nickname, Reds, which was used to identify communists. Several other perceived threats also emerged in the 1920s. In April of 1920, 2 men were murdered during an armed robbery at a shoe factory in Braintree, Massachusetts. 2 anarchists were blamed for the crime. Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti both believed in a form of anarchism that promoted violent warfare against oppressive governments. They were placed on trial for the crime of murder and were eventually found guilty and sentenced to death. There was much controversy and doubt as to whether these 2 men actually committed the crime, but the frightened public was searching for a scapegoat to blame. Their sentences of execution were carried out in August of 1927. On the heels of this incident, a rumor began circulating that a major uprising would occur on May 1, 1920, but this never materialized. However, on September 1, 1920, a bomb exploded on Wall Street. 38 people lost their lives and more than 140 were injured. Communists and anarchists were immediately seen as potential suspects. Many were brought in and questioned, but ultimately no arrests were made. There was almost certainly a strong communist and anarchist presence in the United States in the late 19-teens and 1920s. However, it is largely believed that most of the fear over communist uprisings was the result of mass hysteria and paranoia.
So fine, fine. Oh, I got the alcoholic blues. The blues.
We younger Negro artists who create now intend to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. If white people are pleased, we're glad. If they're not, it doesn't matter. We know we're beautiful, and ugly too. If colored people are pleased, we're glad. If they're not, their displeasure doesn't matter either. We build our temples for tomorrow, strong as we know how, and we stand on top of the mountain, free within ourselves.
With this statement, Langston Hughes publicly expressed the views of black writers of the 1920s, who separated themselves from the literary traditions of the past, which had ignored the harsh reality and the beauty of being black in America. For the new black writer, Harlem and its people would now become the inspiration for much of their work. To them, Harlem was the core of American Negro life. It was the heart of black America. It was home. Soon after World War I, a great many Negroes left the farms and small southern towns to seek a new life in northern cities. One such city was New York, where one of the largest black communities in the world firmly established itself in the northernmost part of Manhattan. Of this new community, Allen Locke said,
Harlem is not merely the largest Negro community in the world, but the first concentration in history of so many diverse elements of Negro life. Hitherto, American Negroes have been a race more in name than in fact. The chief bond between them has been that of a common condition rather than a common consciousness, a problem in common rather than a life in common. In Harlem, Negro life is seizing upon its first chances for group expressions and self-determination. It is, or promises at least to be, a race capital.
In the 1920s, Harlem became a throbbing, thriving center of activity and generated a new interest in the Negro. His lifestyle, his dancing, his music, and his art. During the Roaring Twenties, whites flocked uptown to Harlem to hear Duke Ellington play, or to watch the Cotton Club beauties dance. It was in this atmosphere of acceptance and encouragement that the literary phenomenon known as the Harlem Renaissance came about. Among the major writers who contributed to the development of the Harlem Renaissance were Langston Hughes, Gene Toomer, Claude McKay, and County Cullen. Of these four, only Cullen could refer to Harlem as his birthplace. But the others made this city within a city their adopted home and the subject matter for much of their writing. They focused on the dreams and frustrations of the ordinary people of Harlem, and in so doing made themselves and their city visible to all. Langston Hughes, the most prominent of the group, came to Harlem at the age of 19 and was permanently caught up in its spell. He wrote,
I was in love with Harlem long before I got there, and I still am in love with it. Everybody seemed to make me welcome. The sheer dark size of Harlem intrigued me. Had I been a rich young man, I would have bought a house in Harlem and built musical steps up to the front door and installed chimes that at the push of a button played Ellington tunes.
In Harlem, Hughes and other Negroes found a haven and a new freedom, and most important, a sense of belonging. As Hughes' fictitious character, Just Be Simple, once said,
I like Harlem because it belongs to me. I would not go back down south, not even to Baltimore. I'm in Harlem to stay. From Central Park to 179th Street, from river to river, Harlem is mine.
In creating Simple, Hughes was discarding the stereotypes of the past, which glorified the so-called talented tenth and pitied the uneducated Negro. Black writers now intended to describe the beauty and humanity of the real people of Harlem, the people who were Harlem. In one poem, Hughes wrote,
Caramel brown sugar.
The will to work. No money, no familia. I did not even have the English language. I could not speak a single word of English. I got a job on a railroad crew. It seemed like the whole world was building that line. Mexicanos, Africans, Greeks, Slavs, Americans. The line ran across Arizona, across the desert. There was nothing but cactus and sand in every direction with no sense of direction. And it was at times like this that I would get very, very sad. But then I would think of my little village in Mexico, where there was no work and no money, no possibility for change.
In 1883, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, prohibiting all immigration from China. Before then, Western railroad builders had relied heavily on Chinese labor. With these workers no longer available, the railroads began recruiting Mexicans. Growing cities such as Denver, Dallas, and Albuquerque also needed laborers. Although the flow of Mexican immigrants increased, it was still nothing compared to the giant wave of Europeans crashing into American shores at Ellis Island. But most cities in the Southwest had good-sized Mexican communities.
And the end of the line was in California, where there were towns booming all over the place. And I knew a little masonry, so I got a job with a builder. Today, I employ 40 men, and my firm is known as the best in the state. I hire mostly Mexicanos, young guys like me, who came here with nothing but hope. Sometimes I see one of those guys get that look in his eye. He's tired, and he can feel the weight of every brick that he's laying. I pull that young guy aside and I say, "That's not a brick wall you are building. That's your future. And if you build it properly, nothing can knock it down."
Day is ending, birds are...
Despite the advancements made by African Americans in Harlem, minorities and recent immigrants were largely untouched by the prosperity of the decade. For African Americans in the South, the way of life had remained largely unchanged since the post-Civil War period. Many African Americans worked as sharecroppers, giving up most of their crops to white landlords in exchange for the right to work the land. Most recent immigrants worked for low wages in factories. Added to these hardships was the fact that the 1920s was a period of intense nativism. White Americans who believed they had the rights to the land were called nativists. Nativism was based largely on xenophobia, the fear of anything strange or foreign. One of the largest nativist groups in America was the Ku Klux Klan. The KKK was anti-black, anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, and anti-immigrant. They blamed American Catholics for placing allegiance to the Pope above that of the United States, and believed Jews controlled movies and music, using them to promote sinful activities. The group spread outward into the Midwest, and by 1923 they controlled 3 state governments. By 1924, the Klan was at its peak in popularity, boasting more than 4 million members, including politicians and high-ranking members of law enforcement. Klan members used to go on nighttime sprees of violence where they would terrorize or lynch those they saw as enemies to their way of life. This is not to say that all those in power were corrupted by the politics of the Klan. In September 1923, the governor of Oklahoma placed the state under martial law in an attempt to reduce Klan violence. Police arrested over 4,000 Klansmen during the 3 weeks the martial law was in effect. Still, the KKK remained a force to be reckoned with. In 1925, 40,000 Klansmen marched down Pennsylvania Avenue as an exhibition of their political power. Nativist views weren't just restricted to fringe groups like the KKK. In 1921, 1924, and 1929, the U.S. government passed new restrictive immigration laws. These laws were designed to prevent potential troublemakers from entering America. But there was a racist element to the quota system which favored immigrants from Northern and Western Europe who were predominantly Anglo-Saxons. The quota system sharply limited the number of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, thereby limiting the entry of Jews and Italian Catholics into the country. Asian immigrants were completely banned.
Day is ending, birds are wending back to the shelter wall, each little nest they love.
With the invention of the automobile, the United States started to move away from the usage of the horse and buggy to the usage of machines powered by the internal combustion engine. At first, only the wealthy and the elite could afford an automobile. These vehicles, dubbed horseless carriages, were custom-made and rare. However, one man changed that. This man was Henry Ford. After starting the Ford Motor Company in 1903, Henry Ford had a dream of making an automobile that was reliable, efficient, and reasonably priced so that the average American family could afford one. This dream came true in 1908 when the Model T was introduced. This vehicle was easy to operate, easy to maintain, and handled well on rough roads. The Model T instantly became a huge success. With a starting price of $850, the Model T became available to the common man. This price would continue to drop until 1925, when the Model T at this time cost under $300. This was made possible due to Ford's usage of mass production and the assembly line. This reduced the amount of time it took to build each car, thus reducing the cost. Ford employed tens of thousands of workers in his factory at Highland Park, Michigan. And by the end of the Model T's production in 1927, over 15 million would be built and sold. The huge success of the Model T was not only due to its cost, but also its method of production. Within the assembly line, each worker stayed in place, adding one component to the automobile as it moved along the line. The assembly line moved smoothly and efficiently due to the carefully timed delivery of parts by a conveyor belt to each of the workers. This method of production revolutionized the automobile industry and helped make the Ford Motor Company the largest automobile manufacturer in the world. Due to the success of Ford and his Model T, over 43 companies started the manufacturing of automobiles by 1929. However, Ford was still in the lead, with the Model T counting for half of the world's sales in automobiles. Competition stiffened for Ford with the Jordan Motor Company, which focused more on style than performance. This company introduced the airflow system within automobiles, which was far ahead of their times. Other companies such as General Motors and DuPont introduced the concept of buying cars on credit. By 1926, 3 out of every 4 automobiles purchased were financed with credit to purchase the automobile.
Nightshades falling, lovebirds calling, what makes the world go round? Nothing but love. When whippoorwill calls and evening is nigh, I hurry to my blue heaven.
1920s, the nightlife here glittered. Bands played, and liquor flowed, and everyone who was drinking it was breaking the law. In the first month of the new decade, the 18th Amendment became the law of the land. The sale and consumption of alcohol was now illegal.
There was prohibition, but oddly enough, nobody paid any attention to it.
You went to people's homes, they served dreadful things called orange blossoms, which was gin and orange juice. Revolting. And bad gin at that.
Liquor was now sold behind closed doors in places called speakeasies. Proprietors took the risks and reaped the profits.
It was good money in them days. I was 15 years old. I was riding around with a Nash convertible. We had 4 speakeasies. One by the Daily News, one by the Daily Mirror. When you had a people, you let them in. Okay. A guy had to explain who he was, and he'd show you an ID or something, and you let him in. You got to know it was like family after a while.
Every corner had a saloon on it. Of course, they were never raided by... Their cops were a big part of that business, too. People wanted to drink. It was a great game.
It became a dangerous game for the high-stakes players. Battles between rival gangs for control of illegal liquor territories riddled American cities with mushrooming murder rates. Prohibition's aim was to sweep liquor off the city streets. Now they were flooded with gangsters and guns.
I used to carry 2 persuaders myself. You had to have them, or else.
Prohibition and the general disregard which followed it was the perfect symbol for the 20s, a decade which was about crossing the line, smashing tradition, breaking boundaries. As modern America came of age in the 1920s, boundaries of all sorts, technological, geographical, and social, were shattered.
Prohibition played a large role in building what I call the federal penal state.
I say alcohol must go!
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're talking with historian Lisa McGurr. She's the author most recently of The War on Alcohol, Prohibition and the Rise of the American State. What are the biggest misconceptions about how Prohibition affected American society?
The misconception is that it was a complete and total failure. Prohibition did fail. It was one of the greatest public policy failures in our history. It's the only constitutional amendment that was passed to be rescinded just less than 15 years later.
But then talk about in North Carolina and Virginia, who were the people when Prohibition was being enforced? Who were the people who were feeling the pain?
The people who were feeling the pain were largely poor, marginal violators, working class men and women, whether it be African, in Virginia it's African Americans in places like Richmond and city centers, poor whites in rural areas, but overwhelmingly, whether you're looking at Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, or Los Angeles, it's where it was Mexican Americans, it's largely groups that had already been identified in public discourse as kind of breeders of criminality. So marginal groups that were already discriminated against received the bulk of
So it really is like a not a dry run, I guess a wet run for the war on drugs.
One can think about, there are so many parallels between the war on what I call the war on alcohol and the later war on drugs. One could argue that in some ways it served as a dress rehearsal for the later war on drugs, in the sense that it was shorter lived, it was more controversial, and so federal officials learned from that experience. And at the end of Prohibition did not remove themselves from regulating other narcotic substances, but moved forward in new campaigns and new directions. And it's, of course, the war on alcohol and the war on drugs were symbiotic campaigns. It's something which is a story not widely known, but those two campaigns emerged together. They had the same shared set of logics. Many of the same individuals were involved in both campaigns. So, for example, the father of alcohol prohibition, Richmond Hobson, who was the highest paid lecturer for the Anti-Saloon League. In the 1920s, however, he moved increasingly to turn his energies toward prohibiting what he considered a new menace, other narcotic drugs. So in 1923, he established the International Narcotics Education Association. In 1927, he established the International Narcotics Defense League. And he worked as this kind of moral entrepreneur with State Department officials, with folks within the Narcotics Bureau, to build an international drug control regime. That, of course, far outlasted the war on alcohol and went forward in new directions.
I turn to the right, a little white light will lead you to mine. blue heaven. A smiling face, a fireplace, a cozy room, a little nest that's nestled where the roses bloom, just Molly and me.
Along with, and sometimes propelled by the great technological leap in the 1920s, social patterns in place for decades also began to shift. Nowhere was this more obvious than with the changes for American women. An expanding job market had given more and more women careers and the disposable income to do with what they wished. Throughout the 1920s, women would assert a newfound freedom and independence, and nothing symbolized it more than the 19th Amendment. In 1920, after 81 years of agitation, women won the right to vote.
A woman's lot had changed in almost every way. She thought that she had the right to live for herself rather than for her family, for others, as women were always supposed to. She went to bars. She went to after-hours clubs. She went to wild parties. She had much shorter hair. She wore much more makeup. You go from having young women whose dresses reach to their ankles to flesh everywhere. And a lot of 20s culture is about the fun of smashing prohibitions.
The more daring women of the day were known as flappers and vamps.
Sure, I remember flappers. They were all over the place. I mean, they were older than me. But, you know, when you look at the flappers through the eyes of a young guy, wow, whoa.
I think a flapper was the type of young woman who just wanted to see how far she could go and then would stop because she'd be afraid to go too far. And a vamp didn't care how far she went.
The shattering ways of 1920s city life were spread by the media to rural America, places where the changes were not always so easy to get used to.
Smoking or drinking, being loose with talk, using profanity, this sifted down from the cities, from New York and Chicago. And this finally had a unwanted place in our little community. Here was a girl who'd come home from, she'd been working in Chicago. She comes home with short dresses on. Well, they were not wearing short dresses. They were going to church with hats on and with white gloves on. They were decidedly concerned about what future generation is going to bring.
Baby makes dreams, where happy am I, blue heaven.